Good morning. I'm Joan Mower, and I'm the head of development and training for the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which runs the Voice of America. We are the organization that is funded by the American taxpayer, and our mission is to provide news and information around the world to people who often do not have access to free information. You are lucky in Mongolia in that you have a relatively open and free press. You have a lot of information coming from the digital world, and those are all good things. But what that does mean is that your population really needs to become media literate. You need to have, your people need to understand where information comes from, how to assess information, what are reliable sources of information, and what is disinformation. So on that topic, there is probably no more important role for journalists, both in Mongolia and in the United States, than covering your election process. Because obviously our governments and their decisions are based on the fact that they have to be elected. And as journalists, your role is to make sure that your political candidates, that their views, that their platforms, that their positions are adequately represented before your people go to the polling booth. Now, I know you have parliamentary elections coming up in the United States, and you also had your presidential elections in 2017. So it won't be long before you have another presidential election. And that is where we are here in the United States. 2020 is the presidential election year here, and we have a very, very controversial and I would say divided population in America as President Trump seeks re-election, and it looks like his challenger will be our former Vice President, Joe Biden. So all of this is by way of saying that our country right now is beginning to be consumed by elections because our election date is in November. Our journalists are very concerned about making sure that these elections are covered fairly. And there's a lot of discussion about what is fair coverage, when are journalists being fair, and are journalists biased? So that's where we are in the United States. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through our slide presentation, in which we'll underscore some of the key elements that journalists need to always be aware of as they're moving through the election cycle. So let's start with our slide presentation, which is just covering elections, tips for journalists. Again, for journalists and for the people who want to be journalists out there, I think it's always very important to make sure in your head you're always underscoring the fact that journalism is not just a job. If you wanted a regular job, you could sell insurance, you could run a store, you could join the government, you could get paid in a number of ways. But journalism is a very peculiar profession because it is a public trust. You are there not just to earn money, and I hope you are earning money, and I hope you're able to feed your families, but you're also there because you are the eyes and ears for the public. So moving forward, all journalists need to want to accept that mission, because otherwise you're not journalists. Otherwise, you might as well go and sell insurance or lottery tickets, because that's a different kind of profession than journalism. So let's start. The first most important thing is to be fair. And this is a very, very difficult task for a number of reasons. First, because all of us have personal biases. I have my bias. You have your bias. I know what candidates I personally like. And so it's extremely important that you put aside your personal views when you're covering journalism, when you're covering politicians, and particularly when you're covering elections. The sentence here, cover all candidates and issues equally. So you say to yourself, how do I cover all candidates equally? And actually, it's very easy to do. I come from working at the Associated Press, which is probably the world's best known news organization. And the Associated Press has very strict rules for candidate coverage. And they're actually very simple, which is that if you write this much for one candidate, then you have to have the exact same amount for the next candidate. So each candidate is covered fairly, particularly as you get close to the election. That also applies to broadcast media. You should not be giving airtime to one candidate and not to the other. Now, that rule can be a little bit goes out the window a little bit as you get closer to an election. So for instance, we started here in the United States with about 18 candidates running for the nomination of the Democratic Party. So 18 people wanted to be the person to challenge President Bush. And as the time went on and people voted in states, some candidates simply didn't do well. So they were not put up to the top of the level. They didn't get as much coverage. So what we saw is a winnowing out, people dropping out, people not getting as much coverage because they weren't winning the elections. And ultimately, almost all of the attention focused on about 3 candidates here in the United States. One was Joe Biden, who looks like he will be the Democratic nominee. It's not completely official. The number 2 was Bernie Sanders, who is a very well-known Democrat. And the number 3 was a woman named Elizabeth Warren. So as we moved through the election cycle, they got much more of the attention. Second admonition is to publish unbiased reports. So you ask yourself, how can you do that? And I think the most important rule here is to say things very directly. You don't need to add your editorial opinion. You don't need to say whether in your writing or in your broadcasting, whether someone, you think an idea is good. That's not your job. Your job is to reflect the platforms and the positions of the candidates. Okay, so there's a number of peculiarities to covering elections, I would say, and we're going to go through some of the most important things that you should and you should not be covering. Number 1, cover things other than major rallies, speeches, and press conferences. Now, this sounds easy, but it's not. And by that I mean that when you're covering an election as a journalist, you are automatically, if a candidate has a big rally, you will cover that. If a candidate makes a speech, particularly in our case, when the president makes a speech, all of the journalists cover that. If the candidate has a press conference, the journalists go to that. But those are usually venues in which the candidate is expressing his views or her views. They're attempting to get votes. but what you're not doing is really understanding what the people are thinking. And so it's very important as you go through the election cycle to try to understand the issues of the common man, of the common person. So that means whether it's going to talk to people, men on the street interviews, whether you're trying to find different types of people here in the United States. We have a big problem with unemployment because of the COVID pandemic. So we have a number of journalists who are talking to people about the economic issues. What are the issues you think in the coming election will be important? How do the candidates say that they are going to help people who are now unemployed? So talk to regular people. What's on their mind? What's on the mind of women? Another problem that we've had with the pandemic, and I think you've probably had this in Mongolia as well, is that our schools have closed down. So many women are finding it very difficult to either work or work at home because they don't have childcare. So how do you hold your job when you have to take care of your kids? So this is an issue that's going to impact our elections, the whole issue of childcare, how we take care of our children, what we do when schools are closed. And it's very important that the journalists talk to people, talk to real people, not just attend the speeches and attend the rallies. Number two, use multiple sources. And I cannot emphasize this enough. It's very easy for a journalist to go down, interview someone, they have a friend, they know someone, they talk to someone, and the friend has a point of view. You really need to get balance. And in our country right now, it's very, very important because we have a country which is quite divided here in the United States between President Trump supporters and the supporters of the Democrats. So in order to get a really fair representation, you need to speak to lots of different people. Provide enough information for your readers to predict what the candidate might do in office. Now, I think just from doing some reading about Mongolia that this is extremely important. I have read that your president has taken some measures involving the judiciary that may be quite detrimental to freedom of movement, freedom of your basic freedoms in Mongolia. You do have a democracy. It's a very important democracy, in part because of your location between China and Russia, two places that there absolutely is no democracy. So a lot of people in the world, including the United States, are very interested and very aware of seeing Mongolia develop its democratic structures. And I think there was a lot of concern about some of the measures that have been taken regarding your judiciary by your current president. But what I think the admonition here is, when you're covering a candidate, you need to try to find out or try to figure out, where is this candidate going? What are their core beliefs? Are they going to really change the way our government acts? And I will say that, again, drawing an example from the United States, President Trump, when he was running for election, before he became president, he was very clear that he thought there were too many regulations on business in the United States, and he would take measures to eliminate a lot of those rules and regulations. And in fact, he has done that. So that was a case in which reporters did report that here's what he plans to do. And of course, some of those regulations and undoing those regulations have been quite controversial. He's taken away some of the environmental protections, which has upset a lot of people. But the voters knew when they went to vote for President Trump that this was what he was going to do. So you really need to, as much as possible, nail down your candidates about their future actions. number 5, or actually number 4 here, and again, so important. Politicians can't run their elections without money. It's very expensive in the United States. We do not have completely funded elections. Candidates have to raise their own money. And so it just stands to reason that when they take money from donors, from supporters, from people who want them in office, that those people who give them money are going to expect some payback. They're going to, if I make donations, particularly large donations, I want something from that candidate if they get elected. So your job as journalists is to really find out and to expose who is supporting which candidates. Is there a particular oligarch who is behind a candidate because he wants some mining interests opened up in Mongolia? You have a very rich country with a huge mining interests, a huge mining sector. And so are some of those people supporting candidates because they want something in return? Do you have candidates supporting, you have people supporting your candidates who run media enterprises? Again, we have very vibrant media, and you have a vibrant media, but are the owners of that media supporting candidates for some particular reason? So your job is to try to understand who is paying for these elections, or who is paying for the candidate and why, and to expose that so that your readers know exactly why the candidate might be acting, why he might be taking some of his positions. And it might be because he has financial support. Finally, do your own research about controversial issues. It's so easy now in the time of social media to simply pick up your phone. Here it is. I've got Twitter, I've got WhatsApp, I've got every known social media, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. It's so easy just to pick this up and Google something and then say, oh, well, that's the answer to this. But I urge you to do your own independent research. Don't listen to your friends. Do your own research, whether it's on Google, finding legitimate sources, talking to people who are experts, going to your university professors, talking to outsiders. I mean, often in a place like Mongolia, there are organizations that are not involved in your local politics, and they might be good sources of information from the outside, taking a look what the outsiders think. So urge you to do your own research, to use your own facts and statistics, and to not take for granted what other people are saying. Interviewing the candidate. Interviews are really, really important. When you score an interview with a candidate, you've got a big hit. So here in the United States, when people interview the president, or they interview Joe Biden, or they interview our governor, and they have a chance to ask direct questions, that's really, it's great. And it also gives your viewers and your readers an opportunity to see the candidate and how he moves, how he answers questions. It's important that the public gets a chance to feel the president. You should ask tough questions. We have very aggressive interviewers here in the United States. Sometimes I think they are too aggressive. And by that I mean, you don't have to be mean. You should be respectful of the candidate. You should be respectful of everybody you interview, but you don't need to play gotcha. We have a game that some journalists play, which is they try to trap the candidate or the person into saying something that's wrong. That's not necessary. Your job is not to debate with the candidate. It's to get as much information from the candidate for your viewers. Always in your mind thinking, why am I here? I'm not here because I'm an important person. I'm here because I need to get information to the public. I think it's really important also that if a candidate makes an error, again, this falls into the area of being respectful of your interviewees, of being hard, asking tough questions, but not being rude and not bullying the candidate. And if your candidate makes an error, give them a chance to explain themselves. Everybody makes errors. I would say that this issue of questioning candidates is of particular concern of mine in Mongolia. And I say that only because I know there has been some self-censorship in Mongolia. There has been people who don't ask the tough questions, people who hold back information. The journalists hold back information for various reasons. Possibly their bosses don't want them to ask questions, or they don't want to be rude. So again, you need to ask hard questions in a way that is respectful and not rude. Okay, let me go to my next slide, sorry. Here. Okay, let's look at polls. And I think many of you are aware of all of the models involving coronavirus, the numbers. Again, numbers, we have a saying here in the United States. I don't know if it translates to Mongolian, but the saying is, liars always figure and figures always lie. And what that means is people can make figures out of anything. And it is your job to make sure that figures, statistics, numbers are accurate, that you explain to your viewers and your listeners where these numbers come from. So I'll just go through a few examples of places where numbers can get you in trouble. First off, polls. Before you write a poll, and believe me, we have nothing but polls here in America, and they're very confusing because most of the polls, you really need to know, number one, who's doing the poll. Number two, who paid for the poll, and that is the most important thing. Who's paying for this poll? Number three, if you can, what were the questions on the poll? And number four, what was the sample size of the audience? So if you're interviewing 7 people in my neighborhood, that is a lot different than a selective sample of 7,000 people. So those are some really important things before you rush out and print the poll numbers that one of your candidates is winning and one of them's not. Who's doing the poll? What was the sample size? And what was the method of the poll? Now, what we see worldwide, we see a number of legitimate polling organizations, such as the Gallup Institution. Ipsos is another polling organization that does international work. And those are legitimate pollsters. But there are some that are sketchier. And in fact, we have in the United States a whole number of websites that do nothing but put up poll information and tell us where that information came from and how it was derived and who paid for it. I don't think you have that in Mongolia yet, but again, word of caution about polls. Okay, a second issue with numbers, and that has to do with crowd size and the number of people particularly attending events and rallies. And just calling, again, an example from America, there was a huge, big controversy, I would almost say scandal, that happened right after President Trump was elected, and he was inaugurated, the big ceremony to install him as president. And there was a controversy over the numbers. And Trump said that he and his aides said that there were certain numbers, other people said there weren't. Again, the only way to really verify numbers is, number one, with a picture. Drones are being used a lot now to look at, see the size of an audience from the top. Number two, to ask your law enforcement authorities. Typically, if there's a big crowd and there's law enforcement, they will have some size, they will have some legitimate crowd estimate sizes. But beware, don't just say that, oh, the candidate said 10,000 people showed up. Well, that doesn't work, because the candidate probably doesn't know, or he wants you to believe that his crowds were bigger than other people's crowds. Finally, anything to do with budgets or financial information. Again, this is becoming very important in our election because of the COVID-19 and the economic impact it's had on America and on the rest of the world. So you need to be extremely careful when you're throwing around numbers, figures, budgets, financial plans. Make sure you know what you're talking about. So this, I think, wrapping up kind of my little takeaways for journalists, it's really the personal ethics of covering campaigns. And a lot of countries have different rules, and a lot of journalists, I've worked extensively in Latin America and Africa, and it's very common in those countries for candidates to actually pay journalists, not to cover their events, but to come to events. So this is, in America, we really shun that. We think that you should not be taking any kind of money from the candidate. You shouldn't be traveling on the candidate's bus unless you pay your own way. You pay the bus fare. You shouldn't be taking free meals and free lodging. And you absolutely, the bottom one here is you shouldn't take brown envelopes, which means you shouldn't take cash payments to cover a candidate, whether it's your president or whether it's your challenger or your local candidate. That is absolutely the most important. Do not accept money. And it sounds simplistic, but a lot of people still do it around the world. Now, the issue of whether or not you should accept a free ride or a free airplane ride. Again, this is very controversial in places like Mexico, where actually the president's plane, the president of Mexico, he takes with him journalists on his plane. And the journalists say, well, if my organization doesn't have the money to pay for me to travel around, and if I didn't go on the plane, I wouldn't be able to cover the candidate. So again, this is a really touchy issue. In America, we don't typically allow that at all. But I think circumstances can be different. Again, I just urge you in your own mind to just remember, when someone gives you something of value, whether it be a free food, a hotel room, pen and paper, even little things, they're not doing it because you're a nice person. They're doing it because they want something from you. And so that you need to constantly in your head make sure that you're remembering that. When obviously if someone's given a sandwich at a campaign rally, in America, we typically, in the government, they typically have a rule, which is you could take food if it's under a certain value, but otherwise you can't. So, excuse me, that really is the end of my presentation. I am very keen to see what happens with your elections. I've read that your upcoming elections might be postponed, your upcoming parliamentary elections. But even if they are, you have a presidential election coming up. I just reaffirm my belief that journalists are the key players in elections because they are the way that the people gets information. So thank you very much. And I look forward to any of your questions. You can email me. You can find me on social media. And I'm happy to stay in touch.